Well, welcome everybody. This session is the illusion of objectivity, cognitive biases, learning and decision-making in the classroom. Today we have Dr. Kimberly Booth from NDSU here to offer her insights on student retention. Dr. Booth is an associate professor of practice in the Department of Biological Sciences. Her primary focus is teaching undergraduate education, biology courses where addressing cognitive biases that affect student learning and making decisions about socio-scientific issues, especially important. She spent her last academic year on developmental leave investigating those cognitive biases that affect student learning and decision-making and learning science communication tools to overcome these barriers. With that,
Thank you. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about this illusion of objectivity. And it sounds very mystical, but I promise I'll break it down a bit. So we're going to start with this overarching theme of high leverage practices. So this is the reason we're all here today, right? We all want to make the most of our classroom activities so that what we're teaching is what students are actually learning. But an important thing to know is that what you're probably all aware of already is that the efficacy of these high leverage practices is really impacted by students, and learning is not unilateral. So it's not like students are some sort of reservoir and instructors have this picture of information that we can just pour into our students. It's a two-way street. And another way to think of this is that message sent is not always the same as message received. We feel that in our own personal lives. And so the impact of these high leverage practices can really be visualized with this image on this screen here. So we have this person with a brain, and if it was that picture visual, everything that you would tell students in the classroom would be learned exactly as you taught it. But it's more like there's a funnel involved here. And in this funnel, there's a bit of a filter. So it's this idea that the information that we share with students isn't necessarily exactly what we always intend. And so there's this filter that we're going to delve into a little more, the cognitive bias that's going to affect how students learn. So on a very basic level, these cognitive biases could just be things like their prior experiences, what they were taught in high school, their morals, values, patterns of behavior, identities, cultural norms, things like that. And eventually, our goal after this half hour is to identify strategies to align teaching with learning. So making sure our message received to help maximize these high leverage practices. So I find that teaching, like presenting, is always most effective if you have some sort of context behind it. So I'd like you all to identify a target concept, and I've got a few prompts to help you get there. So first, I want you to think about, is there a particular learning objective that is really important in your class? Like if there's one thing you want students to take away from your semester, what would it be? Is there a persistent misconception in your field? So is there anything that's like, regardless of how much data you show them, how much information you give them, it just, this misconception just keeps going and going, like the Energizer Bunny. Or number three, is there a concept that can be applied to decision-making in the real world? So is there anything that you teach about that can really be applied to everyday life situations? And so one thing that's really important to think about here is that oftentimes, number two, the misconceptions that we might address in our class can really feed into those decision-making concepts in the real world. So I'm going to be talking about a few examples from my own class to provide some context for you to kind of help get you thinking. So a major misconception in my class is that the influenza flu shot vaccine, like the needle you'll get into your arm, can cause influenza. And so this is not actually true, but it makes students feel a bit scared, and that can really cause them to feel like, well, geez, I don't want to get sick with influenza. You might get side effects like fatigue, but this might cause you to think, I'm definitely not going to get this vaccine if it's going to make me sick for a day, and that takes out a lot of time out of my life. So I want you guys to take about 30 seconds to 60 seconds to think about, is there a particular objective that's important in your class? Is there a big misconception you want to focus on, or a big concept that leads to decision making in the real world? And if you are on Zoom, feel free to think to yourself. If you're in here with some other colleagues, feel free to chat with us about it. Right. Is anyone willing to share what their target concept is they'd like to focus on today?
The one that came to my mind, so I teach molecular biology at Augustana. The one that, for number one, I thought about, that we as humans can actually change, modify genes for our advantage for maybe agriculture. The misconception would be, the controversies between, genetic modification and changing the DNA of humans, for example. If you eat some, there's a lot of thoughts out there. But yet when I think about number three, especially with medicine, how that being able to change these things could be applied to treating certain diseases, that knowledge.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of the three things that came to my mind.
Yeah, so this idea that genetic modification of maybe to like GMO apples, if you eat a GMO apple, does that change your own genes, human gene modification? That might feed into this idea of, do I want to eat GMO apples? Absolutely, that's a great example. So keep your target concept in mind as you move forward. We identified in our example, our image of that brain with a funnel, what information is coming in through the funnel. But I want to talk a little bit more about the filter within that funnel. So we're going to call that the cognitive bias. And here is the working definition of cognitive bias. I'll give you 10 seconds to read that to yourself. So let's break down a few of the main terms in this. So first word, unconscious. So it's definitely something we're not doing on purpose. We're not thinking about it. Errors in rational thinking. This is getting at the idea that there are lots of different ways that people make decisions in everyday life, and they don't always make sense, right? There are many different ways to make decisions. It's not always rational. Process and interpret information. So this is that filter, that funnel of how we're taking in that information into the funnel and letting it get into our brain. Information and their surroundings. So this is like what we're actually teaching and talking about in our class. And influence their decisions and judgments. So this is how what they're taking from our class and using it and integrating it into their everyday life to make decisions. So decisions and judgments, that would be like what they're thinking about, their misconceptions. So there are lots of different cognitive biases. Last time I checked, it was like 175. So we're going to just go through one really important one for classroom teaching, and that is the confirmation bias. So the working definition here is the tendency to focus on information that validates one's currently held narrative, understanding, or hypothesis. So the way that this can manifest in really everyday life is just the idea of cherry, right? So you can really easily pick out what supports your already belief system or ways of understanding, and really quickly rejecting anything that doesn't fit in neatly with that. And so what do we mean by rejecting? That means being like overly scrutinous, these studies that don't align with what you already believe, or accusing that point of view of bias, or finding all the flaws in the study, things like that. But what does this really mean for classroom teaching? It can mean that what you're teaching about, if it goes against someone's already currently held mental construct or belief system, they're going to have a really hard time confronting that, and it will actually manifest in taking longer to learn that concept if it goes against their core values, their core identity, their cultural norms. So this is a really important bias to recognize its existence in every single human being in this room, in all of our students. So what I really want to do is take some time for you guys to identify how confirmation bias is impacting your own classrooms. So what types of background knowledge or varying perspectives of your target concept do students bring into the classroom that might affect their learning? So what you're thinking about here is like, what are all of these previous experiences, social media posts, core spiritual, religious, political identities that people are bringing into the classroom that might already inform their opinion on what you are talking about in your classroom, that you have targeted as your core concept for today. So I'll go back to my example. I teach about the flu vaccine in my own class. And so a background knowledge that students might bring is whether or not they've gotten a flu vaccine every year prior. Sometimes students have tried it and maybe they got sick. They got that one day of side effects, so basically their immune system ramping up, making antibodies. And so they thought, wow, the influenza vaccine causes the influenza disease itself. And so this is a very visceral experience, very, in terms of cognitive psychology, it's very memorable. And so this is a vivid memory that basically forms what their background knowledge is, whether or not they would get the flu vaccine. And so another thing to take into account is very perspective. So this could be like, I really care a lot about convenience, right? That idea of like, if you get sick with those side effects from the flu vaccine, that takes away that time from friends and family, school, that type of thing. And so that would inform their decision. Another thing I'd like you guys to think about is how to align with their different mental frameworks. So is the way that you're presenting your material actually relevant to our traditional 18 to 21-year-old students? So what this means for me is like, if I'm framing my course on the importance of herd immunity or protecting your grandma from getting influenza, students aren't necessarily not getting flu vaccine because they want to kill them. It's just that other things are more important to them, right? Like having that convenience of not side effects. So I want you guys to take about 30 seconds to a minute to think about what is the background knowledge or varying perspectives that students are already bringing to your classroom about your concept. And how does your current way of teaching align with it? Is it opposing it? Is it in alignment? And where do you sit with that? So I'll give you guys about a minute. Again, if you wanted to chat with people next to you, feel free. All right, so let's give you guys what type of background knowledge might be impacting your students' confirmation bias. So mine again was like, hey, I got sick after getting the flu vaccine. We know it's from the immune system, but students may not. What was yours? Yes.
Technology and the student intelligences are different from other thoughts, how they're similar and how they're different. And I think that in general, perhaps students kind of lump everything together in their mind, like they're all creepy crawlies, and I'm going to put them over here. So there's a lot of anxiety and fear or disgust when it comes to insects that kind of comes into the classroom.
Yep, absolutely. So I love that you're talking about this idea. Emotions play a big role in how they might be viewing insects or arthropods, or this confirmation bias of all bugs look the same, all bugs are icky because maybe they had a spider crawl on them once. Yeah, absolutely. So keep that in mind of how this background information might be affecting the way that confirmation bias might manifest in your classroom. But let's talk about now ways of navigating that confirmation bias. So these are just a couple of tips taken from a variety of fields like cognitive psychology, marketing, etc. The first step is acceptance. So one thing that people think about is, well, how do I de-bias completely? Turns out you can't. People have been working for a really long time to figure out really simple ways to totally de-bias individuals. Not totally possible. Every single human comes with these biases. So it's helpful to understand that everybody brings that forward. And that's kind of where that illusion of objectivity comes from. There is really no such. Step 2 is avoid the knowledge deficit trap. So this is kind of the idea that like, if only they knew better, they would do better. So this might take the form of when you're on social media and you see someone say something that you disagree with. And so you just data dump on them. You're like, here are all the ways that you're wrong. Does anybody have an opinion? Does that work? Some people in this room do research on them? It does not. It does not. Surprise, surprise. Yeah, and so really what this comes down to is that if you are making a decision based off of your identity, your different political and religious affiliations, your cultural norms, providing evidence is not going to magically flip all of that. So try to avoid that knowledge deficit trap. Step 3, cultivate an environment that supports reflection on reasoning and rationale. So this can take a variety of different forms. So in my classroom, it takes the form of reflection prompts. So if my major misconception I'm targeting is that students would think influenza vaccines cause influenza, ask that question. Many of them will say yes, say, why do you think that? Because I got sick. And I'll ask again, did you get tested for influenza? Did the influenza or did your symptoms really reflect how influenza presents? Like, did it last 5 to 7 days? Did you get respiratory system issues? They'll often say no. And so really what you're giving students a chance to do is focus on really what's underlying that misconception and focusing on their motivation of maybe what their decision making is. So if we ask, why would you get the flu vaccine? Why wouldn't you? Many of them will say, I choose not to because I don't want to get sick. And so you're finding that underlying motivation, what is feeding into the misconception. And so really what we're doing here is we're providing students breadcrumbs to make their own calls. So they have to be able to figure out on their own where their thinking isn't necessarily matching up with what our concepts in the classrooms are. So they have to recognize their own disconnect and be open to learning. Because if you just say, nope, you're wrong, it's actually the immune system that causes side effects, like this is not going to fit in with their current mental construct of, I got sick after having the flu vaccine. And it'd be like plucking away a piece of their mental map, and they don't want that plucked away, right? Like our mind is very much wired to hold like a very consistent, happy rationale. It's the confirmation side is all about, right? So you need to, or what I would recommend is creating this environment where they have to get to that point themselves. So that you can come to the rescue, I guess, in step 4, frame your message to align with currently held mental frameworks. So basically what this means is if it doesn't just help to say, here's, you're wrong and here's 20 reasons why, you have to think about what does the motivation that underlies that misconception or that rationale, whatever you figured out in step 3, what does that have in common with your coursework? So for example, if I were to teach about, you should just get a flu vaccine because it's the right thing for humanity. Yeah, people want to be good for society, but it's so much more complex, right? So we know that students are making these decisions based off of convenience. Really just fly that convenience flag, right? Like maybe set up that type of activity where you outline the convenience of getting a flu shot and only have 1 day of mild side effects versus a week of intense side effects, evaluating those pros and cons there. So here, what you're really trying to focus on is what your course content has in common with what's underlying their decisions and their motivations that might be feeding into those misconceptions. What you really want to do is avoid confronting any main health identities, right? You can't be like, well, because you're a conservative or a liberal, you're wrong. That's like, that is a one surefire way to make sure you are never listened to again in your classroom. So leaning into that theme of those core commonalities to give your message really a fighting chance. So a disclaimer I have here is that this is far more complicated than just a simple 4-step program, right? Like, but this was on purpose, right? I wanted to present it in a simplified way so that you felt like, okay, I think have a few things that I can actually easily implement into the classroom. It's really just a few different prompts, getting students to think about some things. So I did, with our last few minutes, want to take a minute for you guys to think about step 3 and step 4. So you've already identified the core concept you want to work on. You've already identified some of those varying perspectives, background information students are bringing to your classroom. What does step 3 and 4 look like for you, for your own class? So what does that environment look like to really get students to think on their reasoning, and how can you improve the message? So I'll give you guys about a minute and then we'll come back together for share. All right, let's bring it back together. Can anyone share what they came up with for either reflection prompt or the way you might frame a message in your class? What you do for step three?
It's really reflecting exactly that. So I teach English and it's English to developmental learners. So honestly, like some of my students are reading at like fifth grade level. We're just trying to give you basic reading skills. And a big thing they struggle with is like the difference between like fake news article and like biased news article. And a lot of them want to be like, oh, this whole TV channel is fake news. And they don't understand like that's not fake. You can't just dismiss it. You have to figure out where the facts are, where the opinions are. So whether them working on exactly reflection is more like trying to teach them the skill of find the fact, find the opinion. The facts are facts, but then you have to see if they're presenting it in a way that's biased, but that doesn't mean that the whole thing is like fake. So a lot of times we get in there with like highlighters, like highlight the fact, highlight the opinion. How's this fact being used? And sometimes you just have to start with that before you can really move to like the reflection piece of like, do you disagree with this or agree and why? Like they have to first realize that there are facts here and there are opinions and you have to be able to tell the difference. Otherwise, I just think this whole thing's fake. I'm not gonna listen to it.
So I love that your example is like a complete manifestation of confirmation bias to just completely disregard an entire TV channel, regardless of what the message is or how they're sharing it. But yeah, I love that idea of highlighting which one's facts, which one is opinion, and really fleshing it out. Thanks for sharing. So some of the main outcomes that I hope you left with today is that you were able to identify how confirmation bias can affect student learning and decision-making in your own classroom. Something that I really thought was important to communicate with you guys is that misconceptions won't simply resolve by giving them the correct information, right? That's not how our brains work. They are very stable things. Students won't suddenly make decisions that align with your core concepts of your class just because they are the core concepts of your class, right? And they're really going to be susceptible to these cognitive biases. But at the same time, you can do something about it, right? So with that imagery, that brain with the funnel above it, the information can be altered and framed in a way that maybe just matches those pores in that filter in a very particular way so that you can actually work with cognitive biases instead of just being like, no, we're all doomed to this cognitive bias. So hopefully you've been able to develop a strategy to align your teaching with your learning. So making sure that your message sent is the same as the message received, or at least as close to it as possible. And ultimately, hopefully maximizing your high leverage practices in the classroom. Because we're all putting in a lot of work to make sure we use evidence-based practices in the classroom. But if we're not adjusting our messages in a way that helps account for these cognitive biases, we'll necessarily get the most out of them. So I am going to do a little quick shameless plug. If you thought that this talk was interesting, or you think that some of these concepts could be important for your own student, undergrad or grad, I just developed a new course that's going to be taught the first time in spring 2025. That's going to be all about how to communicate science to the general public specifically. So things like addressing and navigating cognitive biases will definitely be part of that. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you for the talk. One thing that we talked about was strategies for uncovering mental frameworks if you're not sure what they might be coming in to, like a new topic, a new student population. Pedro mentioned a survey practice that she uses, which sounds really, what are some of the things that you've done to help uncover what they are so you can align your communication strategies with them?
Yeah, so my favorite go-to I shared with you guys is basically just always asking students why. And it's like, no matter what answer they give you, the next question is why? And eventually you're going to get to the very core. I know that a lot of fields have published common misconceptions in their field and ways to uncover them. So part of it is digging into the literature. So that might be what sort of that survey is about. But yeah, that's a great point of like, if you don't even know what to unveil, that'd be a great question.
That's all, Sean. I'll find you later.
Yes, thank you very much.